colleague once referred a man to me who he said was probably the most successful courtroom attorney in the United States. Apparently, he'd only lost one case in his whole career, and he was 63 years old. If you think about it, most attorneys lose, on average, 50% of their cases, because every time an attorney wins, the other attorney loses. But this guy was really feared in the courtroom, and he took on some of the biggest corporations in the United States on contamination cases, and he was really good at bringing pretty much everybody to their knees. But outside of that, he was very insecure and very fearful and unhappy, and he felt bad inside and felt worthless. He'd even been to psychoanalysis trying to get healed up. He'd had 30 years of psychoanalysis when he came to me, and I asked, was it helpful? Did you find out why you felt so anxious and inadequate? And he said, well, I learned that when I was little, apparently there was a fire, and I had a brother who died in that fire. And the psychoanalyst said that I must feel guilty, like somehow I caused his death. That's why I feel guilty and bad and kind of worthless. And I said, well, did that seem true, and was that helpful to you? And he said, I have no idea it was true. The psychoanalyst just told me this was the cause of my problems. And I said, well, did he show you how to get over that guilt and shame that you've been feeling? He says, well, no, he never got around to that. I was very curious. I said, well, can you tell me what you're so unhappy about? And it turned out he was quite perfectionistic. He had the thought, it would be horrible if I lose a case in court. And I said, well, why would it be horrible? And he said, well, then people would discover I'm not as smart as they think I am. I said, okay, and then what would happen? I call this the what-if technique, which is great for anxiety. You kind of learn the root cause of your anxiety. And he says, well, if they discover that I'm not so great, not so smart, then they'll stop sending me cases. And I said, yes, and what if that happens? What next? And he says, well, then, I'll go bankrupt. What then? He says, well, then my wife will stop loving me and she'll divorce me. And then my children will stop loving me. And at the bottom of his fears, he saw himself as a homeless person living on the streets of San Francisco begging. In his fantasy, he sees attorneys walking by who he's previously beaten in court, kind of laughing and say, oh, look at there's Jeffrey. He thought he was so high and mighty. He thought he was so great. Look at him now, begging, with a tin can to get a quarter or something for food, and then they kick some stones in his direction and go off laughing. And he says, well, I can see intellectually that this fantasy is ridiculous. Emotionally, I feel it's true. I feel that people really will abandon me if I ever lose a case in court. And so his core problem was two, perfectionism and perceived perfectionism. And he told me that this had just swamped his life because he said, I can't even go on vacation because when I've gone on vacation, I bring all my notes with me and I still spend 13, 15, 16 hours a day preparing for my cases for court. I've been working 7 days a week for years and I'm unhappy all the time, but I'm afraid of losing. And he said, a friend of mine just had a massive heart attack. He was about my age and he died. And he said, what if I have a massive heart attack and die without ever having 1 minute of happiness in my life? So now I knew the problem. And the first stage and the kind of treatment I do, this feeling great therapy, is assessment. Figure out why is someone upset. And for him, it's his negative thoughts. And his thought is, if anyone finds out about me, if I ever lose, or if they see that I'm flawed, that I fail, my life is going to come to an end. Now, I tried a lot of techniques that weren't effective over a period of 4, 5, 6 weeks. The reason I knew they weren't effective is I tested his depression and anxiety levels and his shame levels and anger levels and things like that at the start and end of every session. And those scores were not changing at all. And then something happened that gave me an idea. He lost a case in court. It was only the second loss of his career, and it was actually, he should have lost because the fellow he was defending he said he was guilty as sin. And he took the case on as a favor to a friend, and he did it pro bono. He defended this fellow for free. But he was just paralyzed with anxiety. Now, if you want to turn off your cell phone or computer, wherever you're watching this, and I have a little thought problem for you. What technique could we use now so he could do an experiment to test his belief, if I ever lose a case in court, my life will fall apart. And just spend 15, 30 seconds thinking about it. And if you can't think of anything, just take a piece of paper and write down your answer. Can't think of anything. Or if you have something, write it down and then turn it back on and I'll tell you what happened. What I told him, he was the president of the California Bar Association, and there was a meeting coming up that week. I told him at the meeting of the bar this week, I want you to take a little 3x5 card and a pen, and I want you to tell 10 attorneys, say, hey, I just lost a case in court. And that way you can find out if they're going to judge you and react negatively or be critical of you. And you can just keep track on that 3x5 card, and you can have one column if they react negatively, one column if they react positively, you put a check there, and if you can't tell, you put it in the third column. Well, he did not want to do this experiment. And when it comes to anxiety, that means we're on the right track. If there's something that I ask you to do that has to do with confronting or testing your fears, and you're afraid of doing it, often that's the very thing that you must do, not only to defeat your fears, but to find your path to enlightenment. And so I pushed him, and I said, this really isn't negotiable. This is something you must do. Well, I said, you've been suffering since you're 63, since you were 5 years old, since your earliest memory. This might give you a chance to hit the ball out of the park. No guarantee, but I feel strongly that this is something you should do. So he agreed to do it, and he came back the next week, and he was pretty amazed. He said, 5 of the 10 attorneys I said I just lost a case in court appeared not to have heard what I said, and they just went on talking about themselves and all the cases they'd been winning lately. And what I learned from that was a couple of things. First, that American attorneys are extraordinarily narcissistic and self-centered, and all they really care about is themselves. But also, I realized I was involved in one of your cognitive distortions, magnification and minimization, that I've been magnifying my importance in the eyes of other people, and I've been minimizing their narcissism and self-centeredness. But he said the other 5 attorneys, when I said I just lost a case in court, it was an even more dramatic experience for me, because not only did they not reject me, they said things like, Jeffrey, I'm so relieved to hear that someone as great as you can occasionally lose a case in court. And let me tell you about all the cases I've been losing lately. And let me tell you about my wife who's divorcing me. And let me tell you about my kids who won't talk to me. He said they started opening up and sharing their souls with me. And he said it was the oddest experience. I started feeling close to people, and I suddenly felt like I had something to give to others. And this experience has changed my life. And one thing I like about the type of therapy that I do is that it kind of has a spiritual component. It's just not a bunch of psychological techniques, although they're very important to have techniques that will guide you out of your feelings of depression or guilt or shame or anxiety or hopelessness or anger or whatever they are. But there's also a spiritual principle. And he said that he had gone to, church and Sunday school since he was a little boy, and he'd heard this story of someone had a thorn in the flesh. No one knows what his thorn in the flesh was, but he prayed over and over to God to heal him, to cure him. And some people think it might have been homosexuality. Some people think it might have been stuttering. Some people think it might have been bipolar, manic depressive illness. But whatever it was, he said, God kept ignoring me. That's what it says in the Bible. And then the third time he prayed, the Holy Spirit came to him and said to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for in your weakness my strength is revealed the more completely. And he said, I never understood that until now. How could God's strength be revealed through our weakness? He said, I always thought I had to be strong and wear these $3,000 suits and impress people with all of my victories in court. And I realized that my whole value system was upside down, and that the part of me that I'd been hiding in shame since I'd been 5 years old and trying to impress people, that path never got me anywhere. It got me a lot of money and a lot of property that I own, but it never got me 1 minute of happiness. And he just said, God bless you and thank you, Dr. Burns, for this experience. He says, I'm a transformed individual and my life is so different. And that's why I love the kind of work I do, and I work with this is someone who's wealthy and successful. So you think, oh, well, the moral of the story is you have to be wealthy and successful to find happiness. And David only works with the easy people. But actually, my hospital in Philadelphia, we had mainly poor people, homeless people, people who couldn't read or write. And they were such a great joy to work with. But all the same principles applied to them, that we give ourselves these messages that make us miserable. And when you change the way you think, you can change the way you feel. And that can happen rapidly, and the transformation can be profound and sudden. But when it comes to anxiety, it will always require courage, because we all run away from the thing we fear. We avoid it. That's what keeps the anxiety alive and prospering. And the moment you decide to challenge and confront your fear, then you're right on the edge of enlightenment and joy.